Hey YouTube, I'm Will and welcome to Trek Tuesday on the Movie Files. Today I am going to be talking to you a little bit about a one-shot crossover from 1996. This was one of the first things. Now, what you need to understand is that through most of the 80s and into the 90s, the Star Trek comic book license was held by DC Comics. And they did some great work. They did some great Star Trek stories in those comics. And in 1996, that license reverted over to Marvel Comics. And one of the first things that Marvel did when they got the license was they planned a crossover with one of their biggest comic book properties at the time, and of all time, the X-Men. So here it is, the Star Trek X-Men crossover. This was actually the first time that Star Trek had been crossed over with a superhero property. Now it's happened since then, both with DC Comics. Now that the Star Trek property the license is held by IDW. IDW and DC Comics have partnered to produce a Star Trek Legion of Superheroes crossover and a Star Trek Green Lantern crossover, both of which are very good stories, but this was the first one. This was the first time that this had ever been done. Now, it was written by Scott Lobdell, who in 1996 was one of the most prominent Star Trek artists. And it has a roving cadre of artists throughout the book. Various sections of the book are penciled and inked by different artists, and it has some of the best artwork of any Star Trek comic to date. In 1996, up until that time, it was some of the best artwork of any Star Trek comic, and it was some outstanding artwork for an X-Men comic as well. Now, the story centers around the X-Men, who were off with the Shi'ar. They were on a Shi'ar ship, and the Shi'ar transport was destroyed. But before the Shi'ar ship was destroyed, the Enterprise were able to the X-Men were able to transport to the closest ship in the vicinity, which happened to be the Enterprise. Now, originally they tried to stay stealthily aboard the Enterprise and not be detected, but Spock picked him up because he's Spock. And it basically goes on from there. The X-Men team up with the crew of the Enterprise. They team up to stop a threat, which is Gary Mitchell from the second pilot episode where no man has gone before, and Proteus. And Proteus possesses Gary Mitchell in much the same way that he was possessed by whatever it was he was possessed by in Where No Man. And the X-Men have to take him down. This is a very standard book. It's very standard. There's nothing incredibly poignant or above average about it, but it's very good. It was a very good story, especially for being the first time that the Star Trek property was crossed over with a superhero property. Now, I will say that, it's a very interesting read. And it did have, a very good scene between Captain Kirk and Jean Grey, where they kind of tiptoe on the idea of genetic racism, whatever you want to call the prejudice against mutants, in that Kirk was trying to explain to Jean why he killed Gary Mitchell, or tried to in the first place, and that it was because nobody should be able to keep and possess power of the magnitude that Gary Mitchell had, because as we all know, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And Jean turned this around on Kirk and, said, so is it so dangerous that somebody lived with mutant powers? And that's a good little exchange, not because she pointed out that Kirk was a racist or, genetic racist, whatever you want to call it, But because Gene completely misses the point, see, it wasn't Gary Mitchell's power level that made him dangerous, it was his attitude and his mentality and the corruption that came with that power level. So it would be more apt to compare Gary Mitchell not to just a standard mutant, but to someone like Magneto, who has allowed his power to become a corrupting force. Another very good scene involves Gambit. Gambit is hurt in whatever it was that the X-Men were doing that had them on the Shi'ar transport. And Beast, who, if you're not extremely familiar with the X-Men or haven't seen X-Men First Class or X-Men Days of Future Past, Beast's real name is Hank McCoy. This is important. Beast takes Gambit down to sickbay to help him to recover from his injuries. And while he's in there, he gets caught by Dr. McCoy. And Dr. McCoy says, you know, he helps Gambit, and Beast is like, oh, you're going to help Gambit. And McCoy's like, he goes, I'm chief medical officer, not head of security. And as they're working on Gambit, Beast and Dr. McCoy, Nurse Chapel walks in and says, she gasps and drops a little tray that she's holding and says, Dr. McCoy. And both Beast and Dr. McCoy turn at her and say, what? At the same time. That's definitely a scene that gets a chuckle and deserves a chuckle. So yeah, this is a very good read. It's a very good comic book. You can find it on eBay. I really recommend that if you haven't read it, you do read it. Now, this is the first part. This is part one of a two-part crossover between my Trek Tuesday segment and my Superhero Sunday segment. Be back here on Sunday where we will discuss the sequel to this book, which is the Star Trek The Next Generation X-Men crossover. Also a very, very good book. Another one-shot, you know, very entertaining, if not completely, you know, poignant. But they're both very entertaining reads. So those are my thoughts on the Star Trek X-Men crossover. Let me know what yours are in the comment section below. Thanks for listening, and have a nice day.